On this episode of China Unscripted, China sets its sights on the Pacific, and it's found a friend in the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands. Is this a prelude to Chinese military expansion? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Kanejda.
And joining us today is Celsus Talifilu, the advisor to the Solomon Islands Malaita Province's Premier, Daniel Suidani. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
You know, the Chinese Communist Party and Solomon Islands Prime Minister Sogavari have signed this security deal that have gotten, a lot of people worried because it could put a Chinese military base there. That has lots of people worried, but you and Premier Daniel Suidani and the entire Malaita province have been worried about China for a lot longer than that. Why is it? Why have you been worried about China for so long?
Well, thank you. I think, firstly, if we are to go back a little bit in terms of how this thing all started, it would be worthy of knowing that I was part of Sogavari's government when it started in 2019. So this whole switch issue, I was there. I've seen how it rolled out. And
this is the switch. That's when the Solomon Islands went from recognizing Taiwan to recognizing the People's Republic of China.
That's right, exactly. So I think it is the obvious observation that when the switch was made, culminating to the switch, there's a whole lot of activities that have taken place, including the government policy, the current government DCGA policy that I participated in putting together. So when the interactions took place at that time, as someone who was with the government, you start to notice that, the responsible government aspect of the system somehow has been overlooked, and they are interested political views and political drives, I suppose, within this current government that are doing this thing very aggressively. And if I may mention one more thing, the coalition parties that have made up the current government have different manifestos when they went to the polls in 2019. And it's fair to say that none of them has made any strong reference to a diplomatic switch of some sort, except the party that I was part of, the Democratic Alliance Party. We had in our manifesto a statement saying there is need to review diplomatic relations, especially diplomatic missions of Solomon Islands abroad, and to find out whether they are worthy of holding on to, or there's need to see whether it would be good to downsize some of these things. So that's the entry point for the current coalition. They've used that opportunity to bring in the One China policy at the time, if I remember correctly. So, and when all these things, happened, there were interactions that has happened. The Americans were back. There were big discussions about support, and then amidst those conversations, the current Prime Minister was saying that the switch would only happen after thorough, discussions and consultations and all those things. And there was mention of at least a number of reports that the government at the time would have relied on before making the switch. And eventually, I remember of the 4 reports that was mentioned, I was there when USAID and other donor partners were having a meeting with the current Prime Minister, and he mentioned this to them that this is the process that the government will take, and it so happened that at the end, those process has not been complied with. There was only one report that the government relied on to actually make the switch, and that report was produced by a bipartisan parliamentary group, mostly members of parliament, both sides of the house, the government side, was chaired by the current Somaliland ambassador to Beijing, on Novak Fugui. So you could see, if you look at the trajectory, there wasn't any proper handling of the issue. It's far from being honest and truthful. Those things that the current government, especially the Prime Minister, was making known to the donor family and even to Solomon Islands through the National Parliament, was not being held on to. So if we started a relationship based on those things, how could people believe that such a thing is a good thing? Because it started off like that.
So basically what you're saying is, for something as major as, switching diplomatic ties from Taiwan to communist China, that's a pretty big thing. And, the government said like, oh, we'll have a full discussion about that. And then that didn't happen. In fact, it seems like, people with, close ties to Beijing kind of pushed this all forward kind of under the table.
Correct. And if I may go back as well, like I've mentioned, during the national general elections, there wasn't any discussion of such with the electorates, so that people are aware that this is part of any government that is coming into being. So that whole discussion wasn't part of the whole, the election period. Now, when this government come in and this coalition thing happened, it is even strange for me that when we put the policy document together, there was a splinter group, or there was a small group within the coalition that say that they will have a separate party, and that they would be the ones who champions the one China policy issue. But then that group never registered their political party, and they eventually joined our party that belongs to the current government. And some of you, or some people would know that even the current Prime Minister hasn't had a party prior to the election. He was an independent candidate, and then came into elected, and then tried to put together a party. So those things have played out there, and wasn't properly put to the people, I suppose, so that people can engage and see what is this thing. So that's the main sticking point with Malaita Province, being, as you know, being the populated province in the Solomons. They have the feeling that China is an unknown entity in terms of governance, belief systems that are totally different from ours in the Solomons. So there is that concern that if we are to engage with this entity, this new friend, who is very powerful, of course, and that powerfulness of the new friend is quite different from what we used to have with the Western world.
You talk about China having different values from the people of Malaita Province. What are those values, and why is that important?
So Malaita Province, even before Christianity, we are a people that believe in supernatural things, and we have a relationship with higher beings. So that's part of our sort of a part of our society. Now, we know that China is an atheist state. How would that play with us in terms of, if we are to talk about development and the aspects that are related to development, morality, ethics, and ensuring people's properties and belongings are well catered for within the system. So that's the kind of thing I think Malaita Province and many other societies in Solomon Islands and other provinces, we already have that sort of like the fundamental thing that we are, as people, related to things higher than us, and that is very useful to as we go into aspirations of development. Whereas China in this case, although the current prime minister was championing, say, when he went to Beijing, he attended a church and said that China also accommodate Christianity and all those other things. But it, for us, the system, the Chinese Communist Party as a system is based on atheism, which is totally different from ours. We are not an atheist society. We are a believing society. Although Christianity came later, we have already been a society that believes in the higher beings than us.
So, for our audience members who aren't Christian or maybe are atheist, help us understand why that issue is so important. I mean, can't you just get along with people that have a different value system, or is there something in particular that makes it really hard to work with China, or maybe some example of it being really hard to work with China?
I suppose it boils down to the state apparatus. Is the state prepared to able to mitigate these things that we are worried about? Is the state laws, regulations able to ensure that our systems are not intruded into or been used or been tampered with? So I think that's where the concern lies. Like, of course, we can relate to others, but we relate based on what? Based on being human beings, or as being a state that has powers to look after its people. So I think that's the real concern.
And so, the Solomon Islands has had a relationship with China and Chinese companies for much longer than just since the switch in 2019, right? What kind of business interactions have you had with China? For example, logging.
Right. So logging is the big one. The relationship is such that China is the main market for logs from the Solomon and I suppose other parts of the world as well. So that's where, because of that market, and we noted in the Solomons that, mainly it's the Malaysian Chinese, I suppose, who participated in the logging industry in the Solomons for a long time. And it's a very messy industry. I know it's obviously a very corrupt one. And they set the rules. They even have a forest association that are mainly mainly composed, or the composition of the forest associations are mainly loggers. Those people who foreigners, especially the Malaysians and others who are in the industry. So they sort of like capture the whole thing, whereas the people who have the resources, in this case the Solomon Islanders, are just participants that have very little influence in ensuring their resources are more beneficial to them. And this group even affect the way government, put its laws and regulations in terms of the forest industry. So that is a big thing, like, because the industry is able to support, political or politicians within Solomon Islands. They have that relationship, which is at the end of it, it's their interest that is paramount more than the interest of any common person in the Solomons.
So these sort of foreign and Chinese-run companies, they come in to extract lumber, and they also set policy, and they get their politicians elected.
Exactly. So if you look at the logging for that matter, say example, this 100%, the operations is made up of 100%, package. Of that 100%, 60% of whatever is earned through the operation belongs to the foreign companies. And then I think 20% belongs to the government in terms of the normal, tax and export and all these duties. And the resource owners ended up with, I think it's another 20%, but of the 20%, 5% of it goes to the license holder, the person that holds the right over the forest in terms under the current laws of the Solomons. And the resource owners or the tribes that own these resources, they took 5%, and even the 5% and the 15% that belongs to the people in the Solomons, they are even taxed by the government. So you can see there is already imbalance of how the industry really supports people. Most of it would end up with foreign companies. And this thing is not set in law, it's set by practice. And the practice, the argument behind the practice is that, the operators incur more cost than others. Whether that is true or not, there has to be a meaningful analysis of these things so that people understand. But there hasn't been any such thing. Of their interest in the industry, because they take the big portion of it, they would make sure that you know what their interest in it's protected through ensuring the politicians that they support ended up within the government system to protect that interest of theirs.
How about the logging jobs? Like, are at least the jobs, the people who actually are the lumberjacks, are those Solomon Islanders?
It's a mix of Solomon Islanders, and mostly when you look at the job, the higher end ones has to be foreigners, people from Malaysia who operate camp masters or who operate the heavy vehicles and all that. It's only the smaller ones like felling of trees with chainsaws that belongs to the laborers from the Solomons. But the higher paid ones within that industry also are held by foreigners who have been imported in Solomon Islands in under the arguments that they are cheap labor of some sort. So those are the things that really happen with the the logging industry. And then recently, because there were reports that were produced saying that the logs have run out, the mining, the logging companies have now shifted towards the mining industry, and they have their, the politicians that they support readily waiting there to ensure what they ventured into is supported by the government system.
So China's basically stripping the Solomon Islands of all its resources.
I would agree. It's their market. It's their market that that is feed on the logging industry in Solomons. If there is no market for it, I wouldn't. It might be logged, but maybe in the practice, maybe controlled. By the markets. There were standards set by the markets that the producers need to at least follow to ensure the practice is properly managed at the country level. But at the moment, there's very little of these things happening, and they were even what they call price transferring within that mechanism that the logs are paid at a lower price, and as it goes through the process, it's been paid at a higher price that is not known by the locals.
Do you think Sogavari has listened to people's concerns?
Well, we have to look at the sort of like the evidence out there. What has he done that would reflective of him being a listener to the concern in the Solomons? So far, it has not been the case. If you followed him closely, his political journey is a one that is full of controversies, things that he has done, and the way he ended up in the prime minister's positions has always reflective of someone who looks for power to ensure he is in that position, to ensure what he thinks and what he thinks best is good for the people. So if you look closely at sort of any relationship, there is no evidence in my view that would say that, look, he's doing this, he has done that, and that's what people want. So that has not been the case, and we have seen riots and concerns where people came about and unfortunately ended up in a lot of distractions.
Now, you mentioned the riots, and last November 2021, there were pretty substantial riots in Honiara, the capital of the Solomon Islands. What were those about? How did they relate to Sogavari and to China?
So to get an idea about how that end up the way it ended up, you can look back to the history of Solomon Islands, especially the political history, And what has happened in November is not an isolated thing. There was riot in 2006. There was the ethnic crisis that we have had from 1998 to 2003. And even that, before the country went into independence, there was already division amongst the different islands, province in the Solomon, that concerns political powers should be given to people and devolution of functions to the provinces. So Sogavare was there when ethnic crisis happened. He was the prime minister during that time. I mean, when the Townsville Peace Agreement was signed, he was there during the 2006 2026 riots, and he's still here. I mean, in the November riots. The fundamental thing is there's nothing done by the government to address the concerns that the people have in regards to political issues and how the resources of the country is run. For example, under the Townsville Peace Agreement and Part 4 or 5, I suppose, there was clear requirements that the government should address the issues concerning Guadalcanal and Malaita Province in terms of development. So those are the same concerns, I think, legacy concerns that still come through without being addressed by the government. And what they are doing is trying to suppress people, not to talk against the government, and hoping that what they say is what the people want.
So what has the government's response been since the riots in November? Have they changed anything?
Well, if there is anything that has changed, they have now signed an agreement with China to bring in more force to suppress people. I think that's the only change we can see.
There was a report that I had read that said China had offered to send a number of its own security forces along with weapons and armor and some other gear. But it was unclear whether China actually ended up sending those soldiers. Do you know what happened with that?
From when the document was leaked concerning that issue, the government came out and said that they have not agreed on that matter. But for me, for a lot of Solomon Islands, it's the secretiveness of the government, whether what the government says is truthful or not. Because so far things have not been truthful. So who should believe what the government said? After all, there are things that the government has not properly done and have not informed the public at large about its doings. So yeah, from them, they came out and say yes, there was a request made by the embassy in the Taiwan, the Chinese embassy in the Solomons, but it ended up being not approved by cabinet.
Our viewers may not be familiar with the security deal, the secret security deal you mentioned that Prime Minister Sogavare signed with China. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So this is a concern. Before the security deal was sort of like constructed, I think the current construction comes out in reference to the November riots. It was because of that event that the government sees is fit. I think there was some conversation that the government had with China to ensure that this thing come about. But before that, if you follow closely the public media, especially from the Chinese embassy, the ambassador already made mention of Chinese personals coming into the country and would be helping their Chinese nationals. So that was something mentioned before the security deal was done. So I suppose the conversation has already been there before the security pact was signed.
To have Chinese police come to help these Chinese companies, like the Chinese people living in the Solomons, is that right?
It wasn't clear, but they were saying the Chinese investment. But as far as we know, in the Solomons, there are individual Chinese that have run mostly the retailing and the wholesaling in the Solomons. The only big investment, but shouldn't belongs to China, it belongs to the Solomons, is the Pacific Games, construction of the stadiums and all that. We have not seen any other Chinese investment apart from maybe their proxies in the logging industry, now in the mining sector. So when they mention investments, it's kind of interest like, what investments are you referring to? So what the Chinese are fundamentally saying is those Chinese people that are running shops in Honiara and all these things are their investments, I suppose. So that's why they bring in these people to help ensure the investments that belongs to China is protected. Because at the moment you would not see any such major investments apart from those that I've mentioned.
The greatest concern about this security deal is that someday that could result in a Chinese military base in the Solomon Islands. Have you seen any indication that Chinese forces might already be in the region?
If you stayed at Honiara, there is a development that has raised a lot of concern in the western side of the capital, called Mamara Estate. And it is interesting that the public is able to observe that it is highly likely the security people that look after that property are Chinese, and it seems that they are holding on to arms. That's what the observation that a lot of people have said. Whether that is true or not, these are the kinds of things that is out there and people are concerned about. And for Malaita Province, and any right-thinking Solomon Islander, if you look at the way Sogavari and his government has been addressing issues of Solomon Islands, they are quite not honest. The things that I've done were denied at the first place, and when these documents came, they explained it a different way. So why should anyone believe what they are saying now? Because their practice has not been an honest one. So whilst they were singing the song that saying that they would not allow any Chinese military base in the Solomons, the agreement itself, if you look at it, like many commentators have said, it's very open-ended. And some of the terminologies within that agreement, we don't understand, or we don't know what these things would practically mean. And lastly, Solomon Islands in comparison to China, Solomon is a very weak state. Now, if a powerful country like China would want to see things happen, it would not be difficult to see that they could able to force their way in, as they have done already.
Well, so that's a very good point you make. Like, we can't trust the Sogavari government. We can't trust China, obviously. Are there many foreign journalists or foreign officials coming to the Solomon Islands and keeping an eye on the situation, seeing if there is moves towards stationing Chinese troops, military equipment on the Solomon Islands? Who's keeping an eye on that?
Yeah. At the moment, unfortunately, it's not, because of the COVID thing. It's the requirements under the regulation that you have to apply, and the government would definitely use that that space to filter who they want to come into the country or not. So that is hard to. At the moment, there's not much foreign media in the Solomons.
So essentially, this is like a black box.
It is a space that is not filled. And recently there was an incident at Parliament where local journalists were trying to take the pictures of the Prime Minister when he arrived, and they were stopped by the police. This is sort of like a new thing as well. It's not like that in the past. The Prime Minister is always there, free for people. He's a public figure. But now things have have changed a little bit, and that raised a concern by the Media Association of Solomon Islands.
Is there, there have been photos of Chinese security personnel training Solomon Islands police, right? How to, for crowd control, riot control, these kinds of things. I think the Chinese embassy published some of these photos, and the way that the Chinese Communist Party controls its own people is quite severe in terms of both surveillance and, how they put down, for example, the protests in Hong Kong, things like that. Is there a concern that they may bring some of those types of techniques to the Solomon Islands and train Solomon Islands police in that kind of, that kind of crowd control, riot control, things like that?
Yeah, definitely. There are people within Solomon Islands, especially from Malaita Province, where we are the ones who have voiced our concern in regards to the tweets. This is real for us. This is a real concern that, if there is anything else, what do they have? That's all they have. That's all they have in suppressing people. Do they have other practices that we can rely on, or they'll use this other technique that is equal to ours? There's none. So what else do we expect? I think that's very clear with a lot of Solomon Islanders, except the supporters of the current government within Solomon Islands. But people are really concerned that, giving opportunity, giving time, and giving, any other things that happen in Solomon, especially in terms of violence, because of the issue that mattered to Solomon Islanders has not been addressed. So there is bound to be things happen in the same way because the underlying issues that concerns the people have not been addressed. So if it happens maybe in the future, how would the Chinese react to it? Will they be reacting like what we've seen from the Australians and the New Zealand when they were here, or will they be employing those tactics that we have seen in Hong Kong? And for us, that's the only tactic they have. They don't have any other tactic to use. So those tactics will be ended up in the Solomons.
Yeah, that's kind of terrifying because we were in Hong Kong in 2019, and we saw exactly what the police were doing to suppress. At the beginning, it was protesters, and eventually it was kind of everybody, including journalists, and they were spraying tear gas at us and everywhere.
Well, in particular, the difference between the 2014 umbrella protests versus the 2019, the police were an entirely different beast.
Right.
And a lot of people think it's because they got that kind of training from mainland Chinese security forces.
Yeah.
So that would be a terrifying thing to happen in the Solomon Islands. And I know in your recent op-ed in The Guardian, you called the Solomon Islands close to being a failed state. What did you mean by that?
I think that reference is made to state apparatus, the belief in the state authority that should protect people and should look after the welfare of the people. And the incidences that I've mentioned, starting from the ethnic crisis to the riots, these are evidence that, the powers that are vested on these authorities that are looked after by the people in the authority, it seems not to be working. If they are working, then these things would be somehow addressed. So if you use that as a basis to see things, then we have failed. Solomon Islands have failed in looking after its own affairs. And if you're in the Solomons, you can feel it physically, from Honiara to the provinces and right up to the people in the rural areas. And then I would add also that the security deal itself, that's an indication of a failed state. Why should you ask someone else to come and look after the fundamental thing that you should look after? So if you are looking for someone else to look after yourself, it's a reflection of yourself not able to look after you. And Solomon Islands has not been able to look after itself during the tension, the crisis, and even the November riots. In terms of the capacity of the state to enforce what is required of it to enforce has not been there. And also the fact that other people, people outside of the country are able to come into the country and use opportunities within the government structures to able to facilitate their interest. That, for me, is also an indication that, state is not able to look after itself.
So where does the Malaita Province and Premier Suidani fit into this, challenging this kind of regime?
What has happened, the premises that Malaita Province was standing on, is when Suidani, after the switch, there was a communique signed by more or less the elected members of the Assembly of Malaita Province, outlining their belief in how development should be conducted within Malaita Province. Having looked at the history, having looked at the political history as practices by previous leaders, they have developed a principle document that should guide them in terms of how to develop themselves, both politically and economically and socially. So that's where Malaita Province is trying to look into use that principles that are in the document to advance its interaction both with the national government and even with the donor families, that this is how we see things, and this is how we should able to ensure we find a new pathway to develop the place. And at the moment, I've had the experience that many of our friends who came to Auki, the headquarters of Malaita Province, have asked at the question of what's even the relationship with the national government and the provincial government, is deteriorating a lot. And what Premier Suidani was saying, that look, if we are to manage a place, there's need for us to talk and to discuss and to look deeper into issues than just accept what is coming from Honiara that might not be good for our people. So that's what we are doing. We try to have a mature discussion about the issues that this country has been faced with, especially from Malaita, where the bulk of the population is, and most of these things that are happening in Honiara in terms of the riots and in terms of standing up for people's rights, mostly are done or led by people from Malaita Province or organizations that are related to Malaita Province.
So from, Sogavari's standpoint, Malaita Province is kind of a troublemaker province for him.
Well, what has transpired really showed that thinking, which is he finally. I've been following his public views about what is happening. Finally, in the last meeting of Parliament, he mentioned the Premier of Malaita Province. In the past, he always used other Malaitan leaders within the government, his Deputy Prime Minister and others, to deal with Malaita in terms of government policy. But now, recently, it's interesting. It's an interesting development that now saw him actually use the November riot, and then pin down that whole episode on Malaita and especially the Malaita Premier. He has not used to that. He has not, in the past, I have not heard him mentioning Premier of Malaita Province. He would talk and use other languages that would generalize everything. But then I've observed that the latest discussion that he had on the floor of Parliament, he actually mentioned the Premier of Malaita Province. So that's quite an interesting revelation in my view, and one would have to look closely why he ended up now taking tough and even pinpointing people like the Premier of Malaita Province.
Well, so Sogavare, backed potentially by, at a minimum, Chinese-trained security forces, potentially Chinese security forces themselves, that seems like a very powerful enemy to make.
Yeah, because I've said, because of this secretiveness of things, and there is no other institutions or people within Solomon Islands that can investigate or make investigative analysis of these things. It's very difficult for most people of Solomon Islands to understand what's going on. The only thing they understand is when you hear about China, most people will be quite concerned that because of the practice of the Chinese people in the Solomons, they have related that practice to the state of China. The no-care attitude, paying people that wages. Those relationships are actually reflective. People use those relationships to reflect how it would be under the Chinese, under the new friendships way of doing things.
Do you think that, you mentioned that Sogavari had taken a trip to Beijing. Is there more of an effort among, Chinese officials to cultivate Sogavari, and not just him, but are there other politicians in the Solomon Islands that they're trying to kind of get on their side?
Yeah, sure. if we have to see what has happened after the motion of no confidence that was taken against Sogavari by the leader of opposition, when the motion was defeated, it was the Chinese money that they were giving to. It was openly given to members of the government side, $250,000 Solomon dollars, under what is known in the Solomon as the Rural Constituency Development Fund. But the money comes from China through the Prime Minister's office. So it is not difficult to see how the Chinese have influenced or try to influence and try to hold on, captured actually, our leaders for their interest. So it's very obvious in that regard. And even before Sogavari went to Beijing, it was known in the corridors of the Prime Minister's office when I was there. There was conversation from then the deputy, or not the vice president of the United States, Mike Pence, who have offered Sogavari to go to Washington to deal with matters of bilateral relations. And Sogavari agreed, but then ended up in Beijing. So you would likely see, you can make your own conclusion why he acted the way he acted in regards to the relationship with others and his relationship with the new friend.
Well, it is interesting that I guess the Trump administration tried to make some kind of connection with Sogavari's government. But I guess the big reason China has been able to expand its influence so much in the Solomon Islands is because over the past several decades, the West hasn't been a presence in the Solomon Islands. And I know in particular you have criticized Australia's foreign policy as it relates to the Solomon Islands. What mistakes do you think have been made?
The view that I shared in the article that I've wrote is pretty much the idea of believing in the central system. The Australians, of course, they have done pretty well in looking after us, but the concentration of support through a centralized government system that have failed the Solomon Islands, it would be better if Australia would have expanded its relationship with other players within Solomon Islands at the provincial level, maybe, or even the churches, or even the communities, and to empower people to see, what democracy is, how these things interacted. But so far, what has happened is, and there was an opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, opportunity under the Townsville Agreement, that document actually, in a way, put forward the issues that, if you address, would address a lot of issues in the Solomon, especially with Borokan and Malaita Province. But apart from other parts of the document that was addressed, the fundamental issue of economic empowerment, and the division of political power within the society of Solomon Islands has not been addressed. And we keep on relying on a centralized system that has failed Solomon Islands because of the nature of the society. The society is a very heterogeneous we are Melanesians, but when you're in the Solomons, you really know there's a lot of difference. And by nature, geographically, we are an island. Our islandness played into these matters just because I'm from Malaita Province. Because of the island of Malaita Province, I belong to this place, and other people belong to other islands. So those dynamics, I suppose, would have been a platform to discuss much more, open discussion about where to go, and to able to listen to other players in the Solomon, other voices in the Solomon that have raised these matters, other than just the government. So I think that's the premises that I come from in terms of echoing the view that Australia, although have done a lot Solomon Islands, it would be even better to see into other spaces in the Solomon that would be supported, so that what we call democracy can be expanded, and people to realize that this is it. We can be empowered like this, so we can make proper decisions about our leaders, our system of government, and responsible ones. I think that's what I was trying to sort of put forward in terms of that argument to do Australia's foreign policy in Solomon Islands.
So you're saying Australia supports the central leadership in Prime Minister Sogavari's government, but Australia is not actually supporting democracy in the Solomon Islands.
If you look at it in an indirect way, it could be true. Like you support a regime that its practice is not very democratic. Now, how do we believe in that kind of leadership and keep on hoping that through your support, there would be a trickle-down effect to the people that, this is how it should be. So what I'm saying is, if you observe that there are people within the government, in this case Sogavari, have captured the system for themselves, how do we address this? It could be useful to look at other power within the Solomons in terms of the provincial governments, in terms of the churches, in terms of the tribal people in the Solomons. How do we engage with them so that the discussion about democracy and democratic rights and all that can be expanded, rather than believing in a centralized government that has not had that conversation with its people for a long time?
The U.S. is about to reopen a consulate in the Solomons for the first time in a few decades, and they recently sent an envoy to the Solomons as well. What advice would you give the U.S. government in terms of dealing with the Solomon Islands, similar to what you've said about Australia?
So it's a very interesting time in the Solomon, especially with the U.S. If you know, the U.S. have supported the Solomon Islands so far after the switch was made. I think the discussion started way before that. And there was a project under the USAID or USAID at a $25 million US support that goes direct to the Malaita Province. Now, people have different views about this thing. Like, you're supporting Malaita Province, and, they have the assumption that, Malaita Province will be strengthened and do this and that. But when you go back, and as I've said, this is what Malaita Province needs proper support and proper dialogue as approved by the national government, but the discussion need to happen to empower those people at the provincial level as well. So that's what the Americans have done, and I think they will see to it and help with other provinces as well. Because the governance of Solomon Islands is not only about the national leaders, it's also about the provincial leaders. That's why the system was set up to address those things. Then if you continue visiting Honiara all the time and expecting Honiara to have a proper conversation with these provinces, you already fail, because that has not been happening since independence. So there is a need to enlarge this conversation. The donor partners should have a proper conversation with national government and say, look, can this be addressed this way? Or we are looking at addressing this issue this way, so that, that's all these sectors within Solomon Island, or the islands or the province in Solomon Islands grow up together, or somehow has a feeling that someone, the government system is helping out in ensuring their lives are better than what they are at the moment. So that's what the Americans are doing. They have come through that arrangement whereby USAID have contracted entities within entities from the US, partnering with or even registering in the Solomons, and then delivering their support to those things directly at the provincial level, also at the national level. Some of the funding that come up to 25 millions are also directed at ensuring entities within the national level are robust to address issues of investment and trade and all that. So I think that's a good relationship that you related not only at the national level, you try to go down and relate meaningfully also at the provincial level, so that people appreciate that this is a relationship that we all being part of, rather than watching from the province that something is going on in Honiara and knowing that it will never affect our situation in the provinces.
I think one of the big challenges is that, there is, for example, infrastructure investment that needs to happen in the Solomon Islands. And largely, China has been providing that. Recently, they said they're going to help expand the largest hospital in the Solomon Islands. Where should alternative sources of money come in? Because if there is no alternative to China, China is just going to be the only game in town.
Right. So, so far, it's been all infrastructure for Chinese. I know that they have supported some of the agriculture things with the Ministry of Agriculture. But how do you see, in the context of Solomon Islanders, we have been seeing hospitals, schools, and all that, which are very important for our lives. But there's an aspect of the life of common people in Solomon that has not been addressed. The economic empowerment of people. How could this be helped? And I see the modality that the Americans are using are quite useful by way of using their private enterprises to establish in a transparent way within society and have that discussion with them so that we establish something that for the ordinary Solomon can see that this is something that will help my life, improve my life, rather than infrastructures that are huge and big, are centralized in Honiara and has no direct or day-to-day meaning to the lives of the ordinary people. We have, of course, hospitals and all that, which is good, but it has to be balanced out as well, I think, with the economies of the country, the people, so that when these things are up and running, the economy is able to sustain the standard that people expect those entities to deliver. At the moment, we can build infrastructure, hospitals and all that, but will they be long-lasting in terms of the services expected of them? How that would happen? How will that happen if the economic aspect of the country and that belongs to the people because people own the resources in this country, the land, the tribal people. So there has to be that interaction with the tribes, the ordinary people, to ensure that their resources are meaningfully, dealt with, invested in, so that it affects them and affects the way they make decisions. At the moment, they are at the receiving end. And if I may a little bit add on, there's a scheme at the national level they call the Rural Constituency Development Fund, administered by a ministry within the government system. And what this scheme is doing is empowering members of parliament to give things to their constituency. And most of things that they have given are materials, copper and iron roofing and all that, which, again, when you talk about the economies of the people, I think that's not, you would hardly see that happening other than the materials that belongs to the Chinese people in Honiara, Chinese owned and run outlets that have been purchased with, finances from the Solomons in terms of their taxes that are now being put into the budget of the government and that are used by the politicians to pay these things. So I think if you look at that scheme, there is nothing for the ordinary people in Solomons.
So, if Malaita Province had, let's say, $100 million to use for what you call real economic empowerment of people, what would that look like on the ground that's different from the kind of building infrastructure projects that we're seeing from Chinese money?
So if you are a Solomon Islander, the first place you would run to when you're in trouble is your tribe. That's where your security is. You have land, you have people, you have relationships there. So that's the entity that we need. I mean, in the case of Malaita, we are encouraging that. It has been somehow people have seen these tribal people who own land and resources as anti-development because the way they interact with, the machinery of the government. But that shouldn't be it. We need to innovate. There is need for innovation. That how could we make this entity that is rightly belongs to the people to be a useful tool so that we can engage in terms of investment. So that's what Malaita is trying to do under the scale program that I've mentioned under USAID, to see how can ordinary people that their wealth, their common wealth is in their land, in their trees, in their people. And that belongs to the tribes. And we shouldn't see tribe as an anti-development entity. It is the entity that made out of Solomon Islands. There hasn't been any proper discussions of how do we make this thing with the people, ensuring that if we are to capitalize in investment in this entity, we need to see it being done properly, transparently, and accountability. Because what we have seen in the forestry sector is they made the rules and laws at the national level, then allow those spaces to be occupied or to be used by individuals from this tribal group, and they have caused social disconnections with the people base. There hasn't been any proper conversation at that level to allow that, okay, if these things happen within our common resource, this is how it should happen. So I think that's the idea that Malaita Province, under what is called a restorative economy policy, is driving at, to see how could capitalist as a model could be captured under the common resource of the tribal people and used for the common good of the people, rather than having individuals who opted to use loopholes with the system to please themselves with common resources.
Hmm.
There's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, it needs a lot more than just money. It needs a recognition of the tribes and other local leaders and kind of allowing them to actually be involved in that decision-making process. But
China's not going to like that.
China is the like the Communist Party is the opposite, right? They're a centralized power where the central government tells everyone what to do at every level, and you have to do it exactly their way. And they have no interest in having any other power, right? Because that undermines their own authority.
And it really makes it clear why the atheism of the Chinese Communist Party was such an issue. That's not, they're officially atheists. That's what they push. It's not like an issue. They do not have freedom of religion in China. And so these, traditional tribes, that's just so antithetical to the Chinese Communist Party.
Right. It's like any group or organization or belief system that's outside of that is a threat. And, but yeah, so, I mean, I think that's really interesting what you're saying about that being the road to economic empowerment and development, is looking at these local tribes or communities. But to do that, you need China out of the picture.
Yeah. So the one thing, for example, terminologies in the Solomons played a lot of, misinformation, if I can put that way. Terminology such as communities. If you use communities and you drive your development agenda through communities own nothing. It's the tribes. It's the people who own these things. So you have to drive your conversation that has meaning into these people, rather than using some artificial setups and that this is it. I think it's an intriguing, it's a, like I say, this place in the Solomons, if you study it properly, it's a very diverse place. And like you rightly said, diversity, if you control diversity, then there would be definitely confrontation. Because that diversity means allowing people to do things in their ways that are all good for us. But if you as we know, if China, for that matter, who is a centralized sort of system, it will definitely go against the realities of our society here in the Solomons, that we are a people who have control of our small things in our small spaces. And if you decided to put us together and do away with those relationships, it will be very challenging and it will affect people.
So China is definitely trying to expand its influence, not just in the Solomon Islands, but in all of the Pacific Island nations. Do you think, sort of all eyes are on the Solomon Islands? Like, what happens there will determine what happens in these other Pacific Island nations, whether China will rule or not?
When I met with some of the people outside, especially Australia and others, where we have discussion, I've mentioned to them before the security deal, I say China actually finally find somebody of its match in the Pacific, and that's Sogavari. That's what I see that is coming through. So it depends on the leadership of these countries. If you have weak leaders and how the society put their leaders together, that's I think for me that's the key thing. If you have a society that made its decision to have good leaders that are transparent, leaders that ensure that people know what's going on, then it would be quite challenging, even if China has money to play around with. So for me, it's about that leadership aspect. If other Pacific Island countries would through the selection of the people in terms of election and all that, have good leaders who are able to ensure what is happening on their turf are things that are good for the people, and of course their relationship with other donors. So I think it's time for other donors to see how could this be, could this be supported rather than keeping on with what has happened and ended up what is now happening in the Solomons, like allowing the democratic institutions within country, in this case Solomon Islands, to it's there, but the people that transacted those principles and those things are not being well informed, and so they just thought that this is another scheme of arrangement we can participate and get what is out of it, not knowing that this is about their lives, this is about their place, this is about who they are. So I think those discussions, in my view, in other parts of the Pacific, if their populations, their people are able to have that mature discussion within their countries and are able to elect people that stands with what they think is best for their countries, the expansion of Chinese would be quite challenging even for the Chinese. I think they believe in money and abusing people and capturing the elites of these countries. In the case of Solomon Islands, their methods of doing things, if it's known by the leaders and good leaders within the region, it could be helpful to at least, I think if we are to relate, we have to relate on this stuff, not on what the Chinese would like them to do with what is happening in the Solomons. That's a view I developed based on the history of Sogavari and how he aspired for power in the power structure of the Solomon Islands system. And also, I've heard this when I was when I was at the Prime Minister's office, that there are advisors within the Prime Minister's office that advocate from some level of a dictatorship, and they were looking to Fiji as an example because of our difficulties in developing our country, because of the diversity we have and all those things. There is this thinking that some of the advisors within the Prime Minister's office that were advocating that I think we need to have a dictator like Bainimarama who dictated good things, and I think so. Those conversations, while yes, they are this conversation, but it happens within within an office that is very important for Solomon Islands, in this case, the Prime Minister's office. So maybe those are the conversations that culminated into what is happening. And if you look at the behavior of Sogavari in terms of how it aspired to get power in the various times in his political career, especially at the Prime Minister's level, it's very obvious that you can see evidently that he has the character of wanting to hold on to that space, and if there is anything that make him to be there for a longer time, it would not be difficult to see that he would aspire for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're the type of person who thinks that a benevolent dictatorship is a good idea, then of course looking to the Chinese Communist Party, you would have, stars in your eyes, right? Look at all the development that this authoritarian regime has been able to do. And
if your leader wants to be a benevolent dictator, but they're looking to communist China, they're probably not the benevolent dictator.
Well, no, that's the problem. It's not a benevolent dictatorship, right? But I think even in the West, we've seen that argument that, the Chinese Communist Party, well, sure, they're authoritarian, but they can build cities and high-speed railways and all of this, infrastructure development, right?
Yeah.
So billionaires
if I make a comment at that point, when Suidani decided that Malaita Province stand and said, look, we have to have a proper discussion about this, they were invited, the provincial leaders were invited by the Prime Minister's office through the Ministry of Provincial Government Institutional Strengthening. And that is exactly what they were presented with. The high-rising buildings that were built by China in Fiji, in Samoa, in other places. So it's like, that's the playbook of the Chinese. And, having that picture in front of leaders in the Solomon Islands who have very little knowledge about the complexity of how the Chinese government operate, they will attracted to that one dimension only. The good pictures, these things, rather than going beyond that and seeing how these things all come about, what aspects of society we need to be careful about. That picture has not been presented to them. So it's a one-sided story, one-sided story already. In the case of Solomon Islands, that the presentation happened exactly like you said. It's about the high-rising buildings, about this and that, other than the reality of a system, how it operates within different aspects of a society.
Yeah, it seems so strange to me. Like, what's the point of a high-rise building? Like, what's it going to be filled with if the fundamentals of the economy in the region are not good? Then it's just an empty shell.
It is. The Premier and I, we were in Vanuatu, I think it was 2020. There was a conference center that was abandoned which is too expensive to be run by any local, and it ended up being given back to the Chinese nationals to run. So that's exactly what, like the point that you raised. Okay, we can have these concrete buildings and whatnot, flashy things, but what's the use of having them whilst we are still suffering economically, and our health systems are not working and all that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on our show and talking to us. What's happening in the Solomon Islands is incredibly important. It really will have a big global impact, and it's difficult to get good information out of there. So I appreciate you coming on and telling us directly what's going on there.
Well, it's my sincere appreciation as well to able to be allowed to talk on this platform, which is, like you rightly said, it will be very useful to reach out to other Solomon Islanders within the country, share their views, other than the views of the government that seems to be a government that seems to be secretive about issues that affect lives of ordinary people and even the region and now in the world. Before I let you go, the Malaita provincial government, especially the Premier and myself and others, we actually physically go around in the province and talk with people. And for the last 39 or 40 years, this is the first time for any Premier to undertake such a program, to go and visit people within their villages and talk to them about these issues, complex issues, but at least to relate to them in some ways that is useful for them to understand. So I think this is, if donor families want to see the communities of Solomon Islands, for that matter, are supported in this kind of undertaking, it would be useful to have the conversation with them to ensure people understand what's going on, people understand what the system is there, how do they relate to, and how do they ensure it brings to them what they want, other than just participating in a black hole sort of thing. So thank you again for having me, and it's being very kind of you to reach out to me and have this conversation.
And take care. You and Suidani are definitely making some powerful enemies out there.
Definitely. Thanks.
I kind of can't believe the last thing that Celsus was saying about how they literally brought the provincial leaders to Honoraria and showed them, all the great, high rises that the Chinese regime was building in Fiji and these other places. And be like, don't we want some of that action too?
And in the end, it's just a hollow erection. What?
Nothing.
Yeah, they erected the buildings that are not useful. Is what he means.
They're abandoned. Okay, but it's something that Sogavari has in common with Wall Street bankers, right? This kind of like, oh yeah, isn't this great?
The investment. Well, I mean, like billionaires like Michael Bloomberg, even Elon Musk, they're always like, oh, look at China's investments, infrastructure,
development. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is what happens when the Chinese Communist Party is obsessed with GDP as a measure of success. And the problem with this is that it encourages exactly this kind of hollow infrastructure building, because that's what GDP is made from.
Well, I mean, GDP is also made from testing 1.4 billion people for COVID a million times. All of
right,
this.
but all this stuff. But
It doesn't enrich the
It
lives of
doesn't
actual
enrich
people.
Right. It doesn't enrich individuals' lives necessarily. And it doesn't empower them in a way. Like, it's not like the Chinese Communist Party feels that it's successful if it has done a good job of consulting people on the ground about what works for them in their lives.
They say they do all the time. But yeah, it's
That's
true.
what the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference is all about.
It's all about consultative democracy,
Right.
Matt. Yeah. So it's actually interesting because Xi Jinping a couple weeks ago announced a new infrastructure program.
Right. Like that's what China needs
go.
right now. It's more infrastructure.
I mean, they had so much infrastructure building that they had to. This is what the Belt and Road is. They were basically exporting their excess infrastructure building capabilities, right?
Right, like the extra machinery, the extra steel and concrete, the extra labor force with all these extra men because so many women have been aborted
So you
over
send
the
them,
last generation.
you run out of things to build in China, and so now you're going to send them to the Solomon Islands and Africa and all these other places to build, and so these state-run companies can make money and grow China's GDP.
Surely that will never reach a dead end.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it was kind of funny to see that, now they're talking about infrastructure within China too, because now the economy is like, it's in bad shape.
Well,
Right.
yeah, we did a whole episode about how the Belt and Road is collapsing.
Yeah, not just that, but also internally in China
Mhm.
because of the zero COVID policy, all the lockdowns and things like that. So they're kind of going back to that infrastructure playbook again. And interestingly, Matt, what you were talking about the empowerment thing, when Celsus was talking about how they want to do things in Malaita Province, like go back to the tribes and have people like actually talk to the people and have them decide what to do and economically empower that tribal system. I was thinking about what the Chinese Communist Party does in places like Tibet, where,
Yeah.
right, it's like a traditional, like these people are nomads. They have this like herding, like they're herders. They move with their flocks. And so what does the Chinese Communist Party do in order to lift these people out of poverty, right? They, take them, like they're like, okay, you're not going to be a herder anymore. You're going to go work in a factory. And we're going to take you from the land that you've been on for hundreds of years, and we're going to put you in these high-rise apartment buildings because that's progress. That's development.
Well, yeah, if your whole GDP is based on like this infrastructure development, like there is no room for herders or tribe. Worker drones, though. You can really use some worker drones.
You mean people in the factories?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant like literal drones, since we
Oh.
are talking about like a place where they
Yeah, but you need worker drone factories to build
the drones.
the drones that then do the jobs to replace the people's jobs. Anyway, it's not going to turn out well.
No. Well, yeah, I am encouraged to see, both the Trump and Biden administration have made efforts to get the U.S. back in the Pacific, back with the Pacific Island nations. And so hopefully it's not too late to turn the tide.
Good. Let's end on a positive note this time.
Excellent. Thank you for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell,
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganejda.
and we'll talk to you next time.